Welcome to Charleston, South Carolina. I'm Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust, and I'm excited to bring you to a city that has colonial, revolution, and Civil War history. It's also got fantastic food. Charleston was founded as Charlestown, named after King Charles II of England. It eventually becomes the most prosperous city in the entire colonies and the fourth largest. Today, it's a city of 137,000 people and has an incredible history for us to explore. When we think about history in Charleston, inevitably we think about Fort Sumter and the beginning of the bloodiest war in American history. We're going to explore that by heading out to Fort Sumter. We'll also go below the waves of Charleston Harbor to explore the story of the H.L. Hunley submarine and its tragically lost crew. We'll flash back into time to visit colonial and antebellum history at Boone Plantation. We'll visit the old exchange and the dungeon that's one of the most historic buildings in all of America. And of course, we're gonna sample some of that great low country food that makes Charleston so famous. I can't wait to share this city I love with you here in Charleston, South Carolina.
Charleston was founded in 1670. There were English settlers, they were living in Barbados, and they came up to try to get a foothold here. If you look out behind me, you'll see a perfect natural harbor. So when they came up the coastline and they came in, they found this wonderful place, and they actually settled right down the Ashley River. The Indians here were called the Kiowa Indians, and they were very friendly, and they saw the value of having Europeans around them, and they convinced them to move from that first site over to the peninsula where we currently are. That was in 1680 when the first settlers started settling there. The Charleston story truly is about survival. The first 50 years were what we call the grim years. It was so dangerous in the beginning here that Charleston actually walled itself in. We were the only English city to wall themselves in this hemisphere. The Spanish were roaming around down in Florida, the French were up in near Canada, and everybody was vying for control of this region, and the English wanted a foothold here. But after a while, we would become the wealthiest city in all the colonies. There was more money here than in Boston, New York, or Philadelphia. And the way we made all that money was through agriculture. And rice was the big one, rice, indigo, and cotton. But rice was the crop that made folks so wealthy. And so when that started happening, you had the planter class, the folks who owned the plantations, and then you started seeing a shift in the socioeconomic divisions. And that's a part of the history that we're not very proud of here. If you go back and look at the numbers leading up to the Civil War, there were over 40% of the slaves that came into our country tragically came through Charleston.
Charleston's one of my favorite places to come to. I mean, I'm a history geek, so I love the history down here from the Hunley to Boone Hall to the Battery to Fort Sumter. I also love the food. The food's fantastic. People are friendly. They're very proud of their city, and it is probably one of the prettiest cities that you will find in North America.
So if you really want to come and you want to learn about a historic southern city, this is the perfect place to come.
One of the best places to start any visit to Charleston is down at the Battery, one of the most iconic spots in the whole city. It's here where the Ashley and Cooper Rivers join together in Charleston Harbor and empty out into the Atlantic Ocean, with Fort Sumter sitting in the mouth of the harbor. The Battery is first known as White Point Park. The park is 5.7 acres. It is adorned with a number of different artillery pieces. That's also why it gets its name, the Battery, because when the Civil War opened up, these artillery pieces were set along the seawall here to help defend the harbor. There are a variety of different types of artillery pieces, including these large mortars, which are 17,000 pounds apiece and come all the way from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We have a Revolutionary War monument to the defenders of Fort Moultrie, which was a Revolutionary War battle that took place on June 28, 1776. That commander, William Moultrie, also has his own statue here. There are monuments and memorials to some of Charleston's brightest and most historical figures. Once also known as Oyster Point, the legacy to that history is in the oyster shells that make up the walkways in the park. From here, we can walk up the Battery toward Charleston and visit some of the most iconic spots in this historic, beautiful town. Another story from Charleston's extraordinary maritime history is something that not even Hollywood could write. It's the story of Captain Robert Smalls. Smalls commandeers a 149-foot Confederate transport called the Planter, and the 6 enslaved crewmen under Smalls' command sail out through Charleston Harbor, past the batteries of Fort Sumter, and then turn themselves over to the Federal fleet blockading the harbor. As a result, the ship will be turned over to the Union Navy and Smalls will be named captain. He'll earn national recognition for his bold and daring adventure, and in fact will earn freedom for his wife as well as his children. After the war, Smalls will go on to become a representative in South Carolina's state legislature and earn 5 terms in the U.S. Congress. Charleston still has cobblestone streets in some of its oldest neighborhoods, speaking to its historic charm. The bricks that are here in this section of cobblestones also tell a historic story. Charleston itself was a fort from its very earliest days, and these bricks show the outline of that original fort wall. We can still see an original section of that wall right around the corner. Charleston's colonial history dates back to the 1680s. By the 1690s, city fathers decided they needed to put a wall around the 62 acres of the city to protect it from the French and Spanish, making it one of the oldest planned cities in the country, competing with Savannah, Georgia for that distinction. By 1711, the wall was finished, and a remnant of it still stands today, although most traces have been destroyed, because by the 1730s, as the city began to expand, they had to start taking the wall down in order to make room for that expansion. Archaeologists have traced out small portions of the original fortress wall. They've been able to find just a few descriptions of what that wall looked like. As we continue our explorations of Charleston, one of the city's more modern iconic landscapes is right behind us, Rainbow Row. Rainbow Row is a series of 13 Georgian-style buildings that originally housed businesses. They dated back to the 1740s. Today, they're private residences. In 1931, a local judge and his wife bought the first one and painted it pastel to brighten the neighborhood. And soon, the neighbors followed. Today, city ordinance requires that they maintain their pastel appearance because Rainbow Row is one of Charleston's most iconic locations. Because Charleston is so old, it is dotted with historic cemeteries, filled with exceptional character, such as this one here at St. Michael's Church. There are 2 signers of the Constitution buried here, Charles Coatsworth Pinckney and John Rutledge. Rutledge was the first governor of South Carolina. He is a principal drafter of the Constitution, and he served as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I'm always on the lookout for hands-on history, and Charleston's Powder Magazine is a great museum that's offered to give me the ultimate cannon experience. Hi, I'm Chris.
Hey, I'm John. Welcome to the Powder Magazine.
Thanks so much for having me. So tell us, what is the Powder Magazine?
Well, generically, a powder magazine is a place where you store gunpowder, and this particular building dates back to 1713. So it's actually the oldest museum that you can visit in town.
So why would Charleston have a powder magazine?
For defense, to defend the city, and this was the largest and principal storage area for gunpowder.
Now I understand you've lined up a demonstration for us today?
Yeah, we're going to kind of up the game a little bit and show you how a cannon is fired.
Ooh, all right. I'm all about shooting cannons. So
Okay.
This is going to be exciting.
Well, this is what we would call a 1-pounder. And this is a replica, but it's a fireable replica. So I am going to make you the one-man crew.
Ooh.
Typically, the crew is going to be larger, probably a minimum of 6, but I'm going to train you to do all these functions. Okay, let's start off with what is called the charge or the charge bag. This is going to have a 1-pound cannonball inside and a ½ pound of gunpowder for our little gun here. And so what we're going to pretend to do is have you load this. Now this is actually 2 tools in one, but the first tool is at this end, and that is called the ramrod or rammer. So let's pretend that you're ramming this into the cannon. Okay, and it's going to end up right back here. Now we have two more jobs. So put that away. You'll need the other end in a little bit. There's a hole here. This is called the vent hole, and this is called the vent pick. What you're going to do is you're going to push that through the vent hole, reaming around and break into the charge bag to expose the gunpowder. You're done with that, and now from our powder horn, we're going to have you fill the vent hole and then make a little fuse down here.
I'm tempted to...
No. Fill it up, fill it up. You've never done this before?
I've not.
That's remarkable. So trace the fuse back and then set that aside.
Now, what is this made out of?
Cattle horn,
Okay.
which is naturally waterproof, and so the ideal way to store gunpowder. So the next tool is right there with the rope on it. So the tool is called the linstock, and now you have to use your imagination a little bit. This is called the slow match. It's kind of burning slowly. That is what is going to ignite your little fuse that you made, and that's going to go down into the vent hole, and that is going to cause the charge to take place. So like on the count of 3,
Okay.
would have you touch it, and I'll do the sound effects for you.
Oh, okay. And I assume if I'm going to touch it, I want to touch it back here at the end of the fuse. Okay.
Good student.
All right.
1, 2, 3, boom!
So if somebody wants to come here and explore the powder magazine for themselves, what do they get to see?
What you get since 2013, the 300th anniversary of this building's construction, is a look at South Carolina's colonial wars. Lots of activities, Chris. We have a scavenger hunt. We have models where you can push buttons. We have a pirate ship sinking video game. And typically we'd have a table of games and toys outside. And of course, kind of the coup de grace as far as a visit to the powder magazine, the stocks and pillory.
Well, that's for people who cheat at the video game.
Well, yes. Or just general discipline problems on vacation.
This doesn't seem like Southern hospitality. We're at Charleston's #1 tourism destination, the City Market. It dates back to 1788. It's a fantastic place to explore and get a real taste of Charleston. Benny wafers?
Yes, I have Benny wafers.
These are like a Charleston staple, right?
They are. They are a Charleston staple. People come to Charleston just for our Benny wafers.
I know that they're like sugar and magic. What else?
Love, of course, but there's also Benny seeds, which is a sesame seed.
Oh, very good. Well, I'll take some.
All right, there you go.
I visited the stocks at the Powder Magazine, and now I'm off to the Customs House, which regulated and taxed imported and exported goods flowing in and out of Charleston. It also housed many prisoners during the Revolutionary War era, and I'm heading into the building's Provost dungeon to serve my sentence. I'm Chris. I've been sent to the dungeon.
You must have done something awfully bad, Chris, because only the worst get sent to the dungeon in the exchange building.
I hope you're a good jailkeeper.
I think that we can get you through this dungeon safely and get you headed home shortly as well.
Well, show me where I've got
All
to
right.
go.
Well, we'll step down to the Provost here. The exchange building was actually used for 2.5 years by the British as their military headquarters when they occupied the city of Charlestown in 1780 to 1782. And they utilized the center portion of the jail into the cellar here as their Provost dungeon.
Now, as I look, there's water down here and there's a nice round wall. What's that?
Well, this was actually before the exchange building was constructed in 1768 to 1771. was the original foundation of the Half Moon Battery that was constructed by the settlers, along with a half-mile-long seawall. And the curvature of the brick wall you can see here is actually part of the remnants of that Half Moon Battery. And when the Exchange Building was constructed, it was built right on top of the foundation of the Half Moon Battery. They took the gun placements out, certainly, and then built the Exchange Building right on top of that.
So what would you attribute the sturdiness of the building to?
Well, I would attribute it to the construction design. It's referred to as Georgian Palladian, but the pillars that we have in the cellar here are all solid pillars. They provide a very sturdy foundation, and then the archways actually contribute to the strength of the building itself as well. And it survived a number of hurricanes that have been through the area, including Hugo that was here in 1989. But more impressively than that, it survived an earthquake that we had back in 1886. And it's estimated that earthquake was somewhere around 7.3 on the Richter scale. So it was a very significant seismic event.
Where did all the bricks come from?
These were all handmade at a location in Mount Pleasant called Boone Plantation.
I'm going there later.
Are you? Well, you'll be able to
assuming I get out of prison.
Well, I think that's a possibility.
So when we came in, I saw the sign said the Provost. What does that mean?
Provost actually is a Latin term, roughly translate to mean a keeper of men. So the Provost Marshal for the British Army would have indeed been the head jailer, if you will, and responsible for keeping his prisoners incarcerated in the area here. And the British started out using the area to hold just their own soldiers and sailors here, 10 or 12 at a time initially. But as occupying forces of the city, they began holding a number of common criminals here in Charlestown as well. And those individuals may have been anything than just not being able to pay a bill, because debtor's prison was a very real thing then, all the way up to murderers and thieves. And they would have been kept in the area here, and 50 to 60 at one point in time on a daily basis. And that's where the area kind of got nicknamed the Provost Dungeon, not because people were being tortured here, but because the conditions with that number of people crowded in the area here were absolutely deplorable.
Now, as I came in, I saw a fellow over here who's got a parrot. That doesn't look very torturous to me.
Well, this depiction actually represents Gus, our storekeeper. He would let the accountants know on the second floor what was coming into the cellar. They would levy then collect any duties or fees that need to be paid on the goods coming through the Exchange Building. And then that would go out through these wooden doors and would load it onto horses or wagons and mules and taken on to a warehouse nearby to accumulate with other cargo until it became more feasible for it to be shipped further into the colony.
Is there anybody famous who was ever held prisoner down in the city?
Well, the British occupied the city of Charlestown between 1780 and 1782, December of that year. And while they were in the city, they used the Exchange Building as their military headquarters, in fact. And they did house a number of individuals of some distinction, including 3 of the 4 signers of the Declaration of Independence. Mr. Edward Rutledge was the youngest and the wealthiest signer of the Declaration. And Mr. Thomas Hayward Jr. was actually the most vocal and avid proponent for independence from the Charlestown area, as well as Arthur Middleton. Now, the 4th signer of the Declaration of Independence had unfortunately passed away in a sailing accident with his family down in the Caribbean, so that's why he wasn't included in that incarceration. But they certainly held a number of individuals here of more distinction, sure.
As soon as they put their name on that document, it was like signing.
They'd committed treason the instant they put that last I on their signature, yeah.
Well, hopefully I've been a good prisoner and I can get out for time with good behavior.
I think that time served is adequate for what you've done.
Well, it's been pleasant spending time with you down here, Gene.
Thank you, Chris. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks. Now we'll go from the depths of the old Exchange to its heights. The second floor Grand Ballroom was the social center of Charleston and its government center as well. It was here the South Carolinians chose their delegates to the First Continental Congress in 1774. And it was here in 1788 that they held the state constitutional convention to ratify what came back from Philadelphia the prior year. Here, the Constitution was presented to the people of South Carolina for the very first time. The Old Exchange is one of only 3 structures that still exists where the Constitution was approved. It was also here on 4 separate occasions that George Washington was publicly entertained. This room is filled with light and history, a stunning and inspiring place to be in touch with our past. Thanks to our friends at the Old Exchange for a fantastic visit. It's still a beautiful day out, so let's continue our explorations of Charleston. Charleston's a city that's undergone a number of incredible transformations in its history, none so more poignant than that took place here at an area now known as Liberty Square. Think about the idea of liberty, freedom, what those words mean. Because once upon a time, this area had been the epicenter of Charleston's slave trade. Between 1670 and 1808, some 260,000 enslaved people were brought into Charleston, and up to 100,000 of them in this specific area, once known as Gadsden's Wharf. Gadsden's Wharf was created by a man named Christopher Gadsden, who created the colony's longest wharf at 840 feet. It had berths for 30 cargo ships, many of them bringing in goods and supplies, but many of them also bringing in enslaved people. Today, Liberty Square has been transformed into an area that celebrates and commemorates the contributions of many of Charleston's most prominent African Americans.
In the colonial days, this was the fourth largest city in the colonies, and it was the wealthiest. And one of the reasons it's the wealthiest is because of the human cargo coming through here, and that will be through chattel slavery coming from the first passage in Africa, the middle passage across the Atlantic, and then the last passage into slavery here at a place like Gadsden's Wharf.
We have a number of historical plantations up and down these rivers that you can go visit. And that gives you what life was like out on the plantations, not only for the plantation owner and the family, but also the folks who struggled as slaves. The one thing you need with rice is you need water. And right out behind me is salt water. So they built the plantations up these rivers where the water turned from salt to brackish to fresh, and that's what they needed. The way they really got really good at growing rice was the Africans that were coming in, because they had been growing rice on the western coast of Africa for centuries. So they knew how to do it, and they were the ones that taught them how to build the dikes and how to operate the rice plantations.
Of all the beautiful places I've been in Charleston, the entrance to Boone Hall Plantation has to be the most beautiful. Canopied by live oaks, overhung with Spanish moss and resurrection ferns, this is a stunning landscape. Hi, I'm Chris.
Hey, I'm Jim Westerhold. Welcome to Boone Hall.
This is just a spectacular location. Tell me a little bit about Boone Hall.
Yeah, we're in one of the prettiest sites with the live oaks here, planted in 1743. Boone Hall now is 738 acres, total acres, in the middle of what we call East Cooper, Mount Pleasant community, east of Charleston, which is about 100,000 people.
So really, this is like an oasis in a huge populated area.
It is, and what's really fabulous is our history, but also our potential, the future, in that its former owner, Willie McRae, who was one when his parents bought this property in 1955, donated a conservation easement. Willie and his sister Elizabeth donated a conservation easement to a land trust, which will keep this property the way you're seeing it today forever.
Now, I've been to a lot of places since I've come to Charleston, but standing here among these trees has got to be the most spectacular view I've seen yet. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
This is our favorite, my favorite thing to talk about, these trees, called live oaks, because they never look like they're dead. They do lose their leaves, they are oaks, but even in the winter, they keep this green appearance, beautiful green appearance to them. And the wind is blowing like this. You see the Spanish moss blowing in the wind.
Now, I know that this view might be recognizable to some people because it's been featured in a lot of movies. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, its beauty can be seen in, probably the most notable is The Notebook, the avenue to Allie's parents' summer home. It's in the North and South, the movie North and South.
Aside from its movie magic, there's a real history here. Tell us a little bit about the history of Boone Plantation.
Yeah, we count our history of 1681, which is the original land grant. Obviously, there were Native Americans here before, but our history that we can document and present accurately starts with 1681, which is a land grant to actually Mr. Boone's then fiance.
And you said that education is something that's really important to you here when people come. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we have a great educational guides that give opportunities for children, specifically children, things to do and learn about while hands-on. And that could be bricks, that could be indigo, all part of our history, cotton, all our programs, which have to do with our agricultural products here, but also the history that is here with the Gullah Show and the historical dwellings that we currently have, along with the trees and the avenue, all part of the educational presentations that we offer.
You talked about bricks a couple times. We've been to many places in Charleston, and we're like, oh, and these bricks came from Boone Hall, and these bricks came from Boone Hall. Tell me more about the brick industry here.
Yeah, we're still learning a lot about it, and there's some new technology that is going to help us figure out which bricks came from where, but we know our bricks came from not far from here on a property that was Boone Hall at the time. It's not Boone Hall currently today, where there were millions of bricks made per year for decades and decades. And a lot of those bricks went to Charleston to build buildings.
So it was pretty incredible, the impact that this plantation had on downtown.
Yeah, bricks were again very, very important to Boone Hall. Boone Hall was the only one to keep making bricks after emancipation, and bricks provided the backbone to Boone Hall for a long period of time.
Now, you had said something to me in the parking lot about telling the story of the enslaved here and how that can be a challenge, but it's an important part of what you're doing. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, it's part of our education that we provide, and that is the history with the enslaved and how they contributed to Boone Hall. We currently have 9 original enslaved dwellings that are open to the public and to our visitors. And in each one of them, there are educational materials that present a different way of life of the enslaved.
Contrasted to that, you've got the main plantation house. Tell us a little bit about that.
The main plantation house was built in 1935 as a retreat for the owner at the time, who was Canadian. Part of our history, it's not the only part of our history. And so everything, we want our visitors to come and learn about everything.
So what does the future look like for Boone Hall?
It's fabulous. We have developed certain partnerships with neighboring communities, settlement communities. We've also are in the process of restoring an 1850s built gin house. In this case, gin. I know it's late in the afternoon. You might be thinking drinking gin. This is a cotton engine, and that's where the word gin comes from, cotton engine. That building was built in the 1850s to house a cotton gin, and we're going to turn a majority of it back into a museum, thereby elaborating more on the visitor experience and providing more education.
Jim, this is wonderful. I can't wait to go explore these beautiful grounds. Thank you so much for having us.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you for visiting Boone Hall. It is a fabulous property. Very, very unique. Thank you for visiting. Thank you for letting us be a part of it.
Our privilege.
He got the whole wide world in his hand. He got the whole wide world in his hand. He got the whole wide world in his hand. He got the whole world in his hand. Thank you. The very first question I always get is, what is Gullah and where did Gullah come from? Well, there's that continent over there called Africa, and in Africa, there's a place called Angola. Take the "an" off and use the word Gola. Take it from the word Gola to the word Gullah. Please repeat after me. Angola, Gola, Gullah. Then there's the word Geechee. Where Geechee came from? Well, it ain't North Carolina, it ain't South Carolina, it ain't Florida. Which one did I miss? Georgia. In Georgia, there's a place called Savannah. In Savannah, there's a river called the Ogeechee River. They call them the Geech or the Geechee by location. Us in South Carolina, but known as the Gullahs by location. But if Mama in South Carolina and Daddy in Georgia, who am I? I'm Gullah Geechee or Geechee Gullah, right? Took us a few seconds to realize that it took them 600 years to realize that we were one people, one family, one culture. Me done what I had to do. You told me to sing and I done that too. Me done what I had to do. You told me to preach and I done that too. Me done what I had to do. You told me to work and I done that too. Me done what I had to do. You told me to pray and I done that too. Me done what I had to do. Whoa, whoa, me done. Whoa, me done. Whoa, whoa, me done. Me done what I had to do. Me done. Me done. Me done. Me done. Me done. I done what I had to do.
Jennifer, that was wonderful. I'm Chris.
I'm Jennifer. How you doing?
Thank you so much for a great presentation.
You're welcome.
So one of the themes that I really pulled away from all that was that we did what we had to do.
We did, yes.
Tell me about that.
Because we didn't have much, we strive to make our things, or we strive to, make a way of having something like these baskets. These baskets were used as our rice containers, our fruit containers, or anything. So we made things that we didn't have so that we would have something to hold things.
The songs that you talked about too, and there's just, your whole presentation was just entwined with this rich storytelling, singing. I love that tradition.
The storytelling and the singing, I can go back as far as me and my grandma singing together. And she was the songbird of the family, and learning those songs I learned from my grandfolks. As I say, Kumbaya was my granddaddy on my mom's side. That was his favorite song. And then my grandmother on my father's side, she was the song. When I said songbird, she had this whoo, where she can woo you by that, you know? So me having my voice, which I never thought I had until I started working at Boone Hall Plantation, it is something magnificent, because I never thought that my voice carried so well.
So, and you talk about how you learned these things from your grandparents. How important was that oral tradition in passing on the Gullah culture?
Man, listen, passing on the oral tradition was a big thing in our community. Just being able to sing and talk and laugh, and sitting under and gathering under a tree was a part of life back then.
You'd mentioned Kumbaya a second ago, and I'm sure a lot of our students watching don't realize that Kumbaya
was created in Charleston, South Carolina. It was created on the Charleston Plantation. Kumbaya means come by here, come by here. Somebody needs you, come by here. Somebody's praying, come by here. Kumbaya. And when you sing it, you say, Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya. Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya. Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya. Oh, Lord, Kumbaya.
It was really fascinating when you explained how the Gullah language became this sped up version because they were trying to get their conversations in quickly. And so when I think of come by here, it turns into kumbaya. Tell me about how that language speeds things up so you can communicate.
So if you speed up the language, if I talk to you real fast and you don't understand anything I say, then you don't know what I said anyway, right? And he's shaking his head like he knows what I'm saying.
I don't understand what you're saying anyway, right?
Yeah, but if you speed it up back then, they didn't understand you, so that's what they did.
Can you tell me just a second about the sweetgrass and how important that is to the Gullah culture?
So sweetgrass baskets is a big part of the sweetgrass culture, but one thing a lot of people don't know is the men were the first to make these baskets, because they were ones that were working the fields. They were ones that needed the tools, so they made their own tools so that they could collect the rice or beans or whatever they were collecting out of the fields. And then once we were free and the men were able to actually work on jobs and different things, women take over. And that's when the basket stands popped up on Highway 17 and different places. So it became Sweetgrass Basket Highway. It's important to my family because I am 5th generation sweetgrass basket weaver. My kids are 6th generation.
How long does it take to make a basket like this?
So this basket could take up to 15 hours.
15 hours?
It's a little raggy right now because it's my prop and I use it all the time. Being able to weave something that from nothing, because it looks like trash when you first look at it, and you'd be like, okay, how you gonna turn this grass, this bulrush, this pine needles, this palm into a basket? It's all in how you weave, how you work your hands. It's all in how your mind works also, because it goes from here to here.
Yeah.
Imagination.
I like how you characterize it as like the oldest form of textile artwork. Can you explain that to me?
So this came on their persons. When they came over from the Africa ships, they had the items sitting on their person. When they got over here, they didn't know that they would find stuff that were very similar and very close to it. So we also use bulrush, palm, sweetgrass. This one doesn't have any pine needles, but usually we have some kind of pine needles inside of that basket. Pine needles is for color and contrast. Bulrush is for strength. Sweetgrass is for color also, and the palm is to bind it together.
Okay.
You see, it's a spiritual thing to get into wine with your ancestors. Once you get into wine with your ancestors, you learn some things about yourself that you didn't even know. Just being a Gullah Geechee is not just from the talk. It's cooking, it's language, it's family, it's understanding. Not only that our history we can't repeat being in slavery, but we can talk about the history of being Gullah Geechee people and enslaved people at the same time. All we do is keep teaching history, keep teaching what happened, and trying to involve ourselves as in we can be friends. I could say, hi, my name is Jennifer, and you can tell me your name, and we could be friends versus what the world has us in this box today. And that's how I feel about history then and history now. Today, we can be friends. Back then, it was a little bit chaotic.
Jennifer, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was wonderful.
You have a great one.
Thank you. What a privilege it's been to walk these beautiful grounds and learn about the Gullah culture, which is central to the identity of the Charleston area. Let's head back into town and see what else we can discover. One of my favorite places to have lunch in Charleston is on Sullivan's Island, just outside the city at Poe's Tavern, named after the famous American author. My friend Jim Morgan's inside to tell us about Poe's connection to Charleston. Jim, how you been?
Chris, how are you? Good to see you, man.
Great to see you too. So we're at Poe's Tavern. Tell us about this place.
Yeah. Poe's is kind of an institution on Sullivan's Island. As you see, everything around here is about Edgar Allan Poe. And that's because he was here for a year. He spent a year in the Army here at Fort Moultrie, just up the road.
So his stint here on Sullivan's Island, this is before he becomes a literary icon.
A lot of what he became later kind of started here because the Gold Bug, the Oblong Box, and 2 or 3 of his other short stories, he got the ideas from here.
I think of his poem Annabelle Lee, which is my favorite Poe work, and he talks about this kingdom by the sea, and some people say that that's also inspired by his time here on Sullivan's Island.
I wouldn't be surprised. He was not very busy that year because the Army in 1826 didn't really have anything to do. So there was a lot of time when he could write, when he could explore the island, wander around and just kind of see what was here.
Now, a lot of people think that, oh, Edgar Allan Poe ran a tavern on Sullivan's Island, and that's why it's called Poe's Tavern.
Whoever started it had the wonderful idea to say, well, let's do a Poe-themed tavern. They name all the hamburgers after his short stories and so on. So everything's got a Poe theme. But no, it was not here when he was here, and he didn't run the bar.
Let's take a look at that food and see if we can get ourselves something to eat.
Good.
And now we're going to visit one of Poe's contemporaries, not a literary giant, but a political one, John C. Calhoun. Fewer figures in American history are as controversial as John C. Calhoun. Love him or hate him, he had a profound impact on the formation of the early republic. He was one of 3 U.S. senators known as the Great Triumvirate, along with Henry Clay of Kentucky and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. Calhoun also served as vice president under John Quincy Adams and Adams's successor, Andrew Jackson. And all 3 men hated each other. Figure that out. Calhoun's claim to fame might be his constant push for states' rights, and ultimately leading to what becomes known as the Nullification Crisis. Basically, if a state didn't like what the federal government passed for a law, they could ignore it. Nullification's a problem because how can we be a nation of laws if you can just ignore the laws you don't like? But that central argument becomes the catalyst for what eventually builds into the Secession Crisis and leads to the United States Civil War.
In 1860, the Democratic convention for this country was in the city of Charleston. All those leaders came into this city and to have the convention. Now, it was split. Some people backed the slavery issue, some people did not within the Democratic Party. And because of that, they were not able to select someone to run on the ticket. They never got down to one person. They could never agree, so they ran 2, which split the ticket, and we know Abraham Lincoln was elected. Then on December the 20th, 1860, the leaders of this state left Columbia and they came to Charleston and had a convention, and we decided that we would be the very first state to leave the Union. We were the first to succeed. The other Confederate states would follow suit, but South Carolina was the first.
In December of 1860, delegates from throughout South Carolina met here at Institute Hall, a building that dated back to 1854 and was a cultural center for Charleston. The Secession Crisis was coming to a head throughout the South because of the issue of slavery and the impending inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. Southerners were convinced that once Lincoln became president, he was going to restrict the expansion of slavery and interfere with the way it was administered within states. And so, Southern states began to talk about leaving the Union. As a result, on the 20th of December, 1860, delegates here in South Carolina voted to secede, becoming the first Southern state of many who would leave the Union. Institute Hall itself would only survive until 1861, when it would be destroyed in the Great Fire that ravaged Charleston. It actually had nothing to do with the war, although Robert E. Lee, who commanded Confederate forces in Northern Virginia, was here at the time and witnessed the fire. More than 540 acres of the city were destroyed, nearly 600 households were ravaged, and damage reached almost $8 million.
The Civil War in Charleston, this is where it started. This is the longest, bloodiest, and it is the most famous insurrection in United States history. It started right here at Fort Sumter, just over my shoulder. So over the years, the Union Navy is going to come here, the Union Army is going to come here. They're going to fight at places like Secessionville, over on James Island, Morris Island. The H.L. Hunley will take to the sea and go out and sink the Housatonic. So there's a lot of actions that take place out here. This goes on for the next 4 years. And Charleston doesn't fall to Union forces until February of 1865. And quite frankly, it's not the most important city in the South whenever it comes to the strategy of war, but it's the symbolism of Charleston. This is the hotbed of the hotheads of secession. And this is what we have to cut the head off the snake, and it started in Charleston.
An experience of its own, the ferry ride to Fort Sumter, which is situated in the middle of Charleston Harbor, offers stunning views of the area's waterways. We board the ferry, where we meet up with our guide, Park Ranger Gary. Charleston to Fort Sumter, that seems like it's kind of a stretch.
It is. It's 3 miles from the, let's just say the tip of the peninsula, which is, we call it the Battery, out to Fort Sumter, which is near the harbor entrance.
Now, a lot of people think that the Confederates put cannon in the battery and fired on the fort from there.
No, sir. Never happened. It's called out of range. The old smoothbore cannons of the day could fire the round cannonballs on the average of about 1.25 miles. So if you were going to set up cannons on the islands or thinking of hitting Fort Sumter, you would have to be on the islands around the fort, such as Sullivan's Island, Morris Island, and James Island. Now, those locations, you could actually hit Fort Sumter because you're within that 1.25 mile range, but nothing from the city, too far away.
Now, a lot of people kind of had that mistaken assumption that Fort Sumter and that was it. But there's actually a lot of military action that happens around Charleston over the course of the entire war.
In fact, when we reach the fort, the appearance of the fort itself in the state that it's in today is due to what happened later in the war, not April 1861. Charleston was under siege from Union artillery on Morris Island from the summer of 1863 to the beginning of 1865. So we're actually sailing through the most bombarded area in all of North America to this day.
Oh, wow.
It was a pretty long siege. The Confederates dug in, they're not going to give it up. And the Union Army, once they started, well, they have to see it through. So it kind of stalemated after a while, but the Union's gaining the upper hands by really tearing up the city, reducing Fort Sumter to rubble from hitting it repeatedly, sometimes up to 500 times a day. But that's new artillery. Remember that the old round cannonballs can only go 1.25 miles. By 1863, the Union has rifled artillery, and they're firing 100, 200, 300-pound bullet-shaped projectiles a distance of 5 miles.
Wow. Holy.
So that is the big innovation, really, in artillery during the Civil War is coming online of widespread use of rifled artillery.
We're getting ready to pull into one of the most iconic Civil War sites in the whole country. This is incredible. So Gary, we're standing outside of the fort and I can see a lot of different features, which seems to reflect a lot of different time periods. What are we looking at?
Sure. What you're seeing here with the brickwork, that's the bottom part of the old Pentagon-shaped fort. We were built on top of a large submerged sandbar, about 3 acres in size, and ideally Mother Nature gave us a good place to build a fort, because on the other side of the ship channel is our older fort, Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island. Now the fort stands on a man-made foundation of 70,000 tons of New England granite. So I could say not England, New England, that means quarried in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and moved down the coastline by water. And then they built this huge rock island, and then they're building the fort on top of that. What you're seeing here is part of the 6 million bricks that the Army purchased from area plantation brickyards. So every brick has its own story in that it was handmade by an enslaved person that worked on one of our area plantations that had a working brickyard.
Wow, handmade.
Yeah.
And this is only a fraction of the bricks that actually made up the fort. What did the fort originally look like?
That's right. This wall that you see here would have went up 50 feet. What you're seeing here, this is actually called the Gorge Wall, or the base of the Pentagon, or the back side. Now, since this side faced shallow water, you did not have first or second level gun rooms on this wall of the fort. On the other 4 sides of the Pentagon, you would have had 2 sets of arched gun rooms and then a flat top. So that means 4 sides of the fort would have had 3 levels of guns. Now, the fort was designed to mount 135 cannons and garrison 650 soldiers. Because of the coming of the Civil War, none of that ever happened. The fort was never fully fitted out as designed, and there were only 60 pieces of artillery here at the beginning. And as far as manpower, we're looking at just under 100. We know there were 85 men in the U.S. Army here and about 10 civilians that were associated with the federal government one way or another that cast their lot with Major Anderson, stayed here in the fort. So you've got about 95 souls inside the fort and about 2,000 Confederate soldiers on the islands around us. So not only are they outmanned drastically and outgunned, but they put up a good fight for 34 hours.
Now, one of the things that we can see from here is this flagpole, and there's a red stripe on the flagpole itself. What does that red...
Right. Now, the red stripe indicates the original height of the fort when it was 50 feet tall. That's 50 feet off of the water level where we're close to right here. So what the fort's actually missing is its upper 2 levels and the interior buildings. Now, the reason that just the bottom part of the old Pentagon fort remains today is imagine the upper 2 levels shot full of holes from Union artillery on Morris Island right in back of us. And remember, they're hitting the place sometimes 500 times a day. When the upper part of the fort started to collapse, it's falling straight down and burying the bottom portion largely intact. So that means your whole bottom set of gun rooms got buried under all this rubble, largely intact. And that was actually better for the Confederates that are going to hang on to it, because the fort turned itself into an underground tunnel bunker system where the Confederates could still live underground during day when the place is under siege. And usually the Union would cease fire at nightfall. Then the Confederate soldiers would come out and work on reinforcing the wall, usually just by taking rubble and heaping it higher and higher, trying to maintain that defensive perimeter. Because once the Union started firing on it from Morris Island, that tall masonry wall was now a liability. So turning itself into a huge earthwork actually served the Confederates a little bit better for the duration that they hung on to the fort.
So one of the other structures that we can see from out here is this large black portion that cuts across the middle of the fort. What's that?
Yes, sir. That's Battery Isaac Hugie. And that was built in the middle of the old fort, starting in 1898. Finished it up a little over a year later. It was put in service around 1900. And it had 2 large 12-inch coastal defense rifles. So you think these are modern breech loaders. So kind of think of a small battleship type gun on shore.
So Gary, our first stop inside the fort is your favorite piece. Tell me about this.
Hey, This is believed to be one of Fort Sumter's original 60 guns. We'll see a lot more throughout the fort, but the Confederates did a lot of moving around of artillery. This piece was cast in Boston in 1856. It's a 42-pounder, meaning it'll fire a 42-pound round ball, a distance of about 1.25 miles. This setup that you see right here of the barrel on a replica wooden carriage is what you would have seen in each of the gun rooms.
And I see that it's on a track that allows them to swivel it.
That's right, because remember, the fort's purpose in life was fighting ships. And ships out there, ideally, they're going to be mobile lest they become a sitting duck. So these, as the ships maneuver around out there, the actual gunners in the gun rooms are actually following the movement of the ship. So if you need to swing the carriage a little right or left to get a good shot, you can do that. It'll keep everything nice and greased up, a little manpower and pry bars, and you could swing this whole thing right or left on the tracks.
The brickwork here is amazing.
It is. That was some good masonry work back then. And it's all load bearing, and a lot of this technology goes back to the Romans because there used to be 2 gun levels above us. And imagine just the weight of the fort and the artillery bearing down on this foundation. If you dug up this floor, you will find an inverted arch underneath us. And that helps in the load bearing. So there's a lot of neat engineering that went into these forts. There's a lot of it you don't even see.
Wow, wow. So were there any casualties as a result of the April bombardment?
There were not, either side. 0 casualties as a result of the 34-hour bombardment.
Now, a lot of people don't realize that the Confederates take possession of the fort after that, and then they control Fort Sumter for the duration of the war.
They do. 1862 was pretty quiet for them. The fort's still 50 feet tall. The interior buildings took most of the damage of that initial bombardment that started the war. But the destruction of the fort started in 1863 when Union forces, coming up the coastline from the previously seized Beaufort Hilton Head area, captured Morris Island behind us, mounted your newer, longer-range rifled artillery, and then began a siege of Charleston Harbor, basically hitting the city 3 miles from us, and poor old Fort Sumter sitting here point-blank range. You know, on a heavy day, they were sometimes hitting the place 500 times a day with projectiles such as one that we see still stuck in the wall here. Now, this is a solid 100-pound Parrott projectile, came from a gun on Morris Island. Most of the destruction that you see was caused by its exploding cousin called a shell. That would be an empty projectile stuffed with gunpowder and actually had a fuse in the nose. So when it comes flying in, it's going to strike this soft brick. And remember, they're spinning like little drill bits. They're going to burrow the nose into the brick, explode, blowing out huge chunks of the wall. Remember, this is basically an 1820s design meant to be hit by round cannonballs coming in from ships. Now, the fort's being hit from powerful new guns fixed on an island barely 1.5 miles away. So it's beyond the capability of the structure of holding up very long. The interior buildings destroyed, upper 2 levels of the fort destroyed, and that's why you only see the bottom part of the old fort today remaining out here.
And the Federals do finally come back almost 4 years to the day.
Sure. You know, amazingly, the Charleston area was under siege for 1.5 years, but it wasn't the siege that brought the Confederate flag down here. It was something totally different. It's the huge army of General William Tecumseh Sherman that had been done with Georgia, leaving Savannah, and now moving through South Carolina. This huge army is moving west of the city, basically cutting Charleston off from the rest of the world. The remnant of the Confederate Army that was left here realized that they didn't have any options. So with the coastline still open all the way to North Carolina, on the night of February 17th, the last of the Confederate Army abandoned the Charleston area, which was a very hard, heartbreaking decision to do, to abandon Charleston, the city known as the cradle of secession. So the very next day, Union troops started to walk right in at their leisure. Stars and Stripes goes up, and the Civil War is basically over in the Charleston area, February 18th, 1865.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for visiting. It's been great.
I appreciate it.
Take care.
Thanks. There's a sad postscript to the story of Fort Sumter. On April 14, 1865, Major General Anderson came back to the fort to raise the flag over the fort that he had surrendered just 4 years earlier. President Abraham Lincoln was invited to that ceremony, but chose instead to stay in Washington because of the fast unfolding events in Northern Virginia. As a result, instead of being here for the ceremony, he had a fateful appointment at Ford's Theater, where he met John Wilkes Booth in what would become his final night. If we walk out to the seaward side of Fort Sumter, we can see the Atlantic Ocean. And in the near distance, we can see the tip of Morris Island, where in the summer of 1863, the 54th Massachusetts made its famous charge against Battery Wagner. They weren't the only troops involved, but of course their story has become inspirational, talking about the involvement of black troops helping to fight for and defend their own freedom.
Get Mel, 54th! Get Mel!
The movie Glory made their story famous and certainly holds it up as a paragon for the experience of black troops fighting for and defending their own freedom as they have come out of slavery. Property at Morris Island was preserved by members of the American Battlefield Trust. Morris Island wasn't the 54th Massachusetts' only experience in the Charleston area. After Confederates evacuated the city in February of 1865, federal forces reoccupied, and the 54th made its headquarters across the Cooper River in Mount Pleasant. Their headquarters was here at the Wilden House, which was owned by a famous Charleston planter. Wilden's son, John, was among the Citadel students who fired upon the Union supply ship the Star of the West in January 1861. That ship was trying to resupply Fort Sumter. This is well before the famous firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. Hi, I'm Chris.
Hi, Chris. I'm Kellen. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for having us today.
Thanks for coming out. Love having you.
So we're at the Hunley Center. What's the Hunley?
The Hunley is the first successful combat submarine in history. It was in the Civil War, and it brought down a Union ship, so that's its claim to fame.
Now, is this the Hunley behind us?
This is not the Hunley. Let's be perfectly clear. This is a replica of what was before the Hunley.
So a lot of what you guys do here is to tell the story of submarine warfare during the Civil War and how that all relates to the Hunley.
Right. The Hunley started at submarine warfare. So but there's also a big mystery surrounding the Hunley is she never came back. So she did her mission, and then she was never heard from again.
So tell me a little bit about the Hunley's mission.
So the Hunley was used to basically break the blockade that was surrounding Charleston's harbor. And they went out, successfully did their mission, and they signaled that they were coming back, and then they just never came back. And then in '95, Clive Cussler's dive team actually found the Hunley, and then it took about 5 years for them to figure out how to raise that from the ocean floor.
So then the question becomes, what do we do with this big submarine?
Right, what do you do with it? And also it had a crew of 8 people on there, so we wanted to make sure the bodies were handled with dignity, and there was a full burial for them. And then just getting inside the submarine, getting all the artifacts out, and then taking care of it and conserving it for future display.
Now, how did the Hunley get its name?
It is from one of the financiers, Horace Lawson Hunley. That's why it's called H.L. Hunley. And he actually perished on part of the second crew.
So as we explore the Hunley Center, tell me a little bit about what it is you do here.
So we like to showcase like different aspects of the project. It's very historical and it's also very scientific.
I understand we're going to get to see some of that today.
You are, and you're going to get to actually meet one of our archaeologists, and he's going to take you through the lab and everything.
We've also got a museum. We've got the Hunley itself.
We've got different exhibits, interactive exhibits. You can get into a Hunley and actually crank to see what it would be like, so that's fun to do.
I can't wait.
Have a great time.
Thank you. This way to begin the Hunley journey. I hope this has a better ending for me than it did for the Hunley crew. Over here, we've got a movie prop that shows you what it was like, and we could sit right inside and turn the crank, but rather than sit in the movie prop, we're gonna go into an actual reproduction in just a second. If we walk over here into this actual reproduction, we're really gonna see what it was like to be inside one of those iron lungs of submarines. Listen to the sound as we're revving the engine. See, I gotta use leverage. This is terrible. No wonder it took 7 of them to crank this thing. They're under here for 2 hours trying to keep this thing moving. These men operated under terrible conditions, and yet they felt that they were on a mission heading toward destiny.
Hey, welcome.
Hi, I'm Chris.
Hey, I'm Nick, one of the archaeologists here.
Tell me about some of the archaeological work you've been doing.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've been focusing on is Lieutenant Dixon and some of his personal artifacts. So some of what we're looking at here are his suspenders, buttons, he has his binoculars, his pocket knife, and what that can tell us about who he was as an individual. For instance, his suspender buckles are engraved silver with his initials. So they're kind of fancy for the time. That's what we've been working on a lot right now, is looking at personal artifacts and what they can tell us about the crew.
And he was wearing a different sort of clothing than some of the folks that were on there. That tells you something different about him too, right?
Absolutely. Some of his clothing survived really, really well in terms of preservation, especially compared to other crew members. And what we've actually been able to determine is that he was wearing all cashmere. So he had a cashmere jacket as well as cashmere pants and suede boots. So, you know, he's obviously a man of means. He cares about his stature. So yeah, that tells us a lot about who he was as an individual and how he probably felt about that night and going into battle.
I can imagine he felt hot being in a little metal tube.
I imagine it was quite warm. However, he was one of the only crew members who wasn't operating the crank. So in some ways he has, you know, a less demanding job, at least physically.
Lieutenant Dixon has one of the more famous individual stories here because of a gold coin. Tell us about that.
Correct. So the famous story about Dixon and his gold coin was that he was shot and wounded at the Battle of Shiloh. And he survived because he had a gold coin in his pocket that took the brunt of the shot. And after that, he kept that gold coin as a good luck charm. And that was always in the historical record until we were excavating the Hunley and actually found that gold coin, dented, engraved, right there in his pocket. So it told us exactly what happened.
It wasn't just a myth, it was reality.
It was real.
So can we see the Hunley itself?
Absolutely, right this way.
This is absolutely incredible. I mean, look how well you can see this.
It's pretty amazing, and we try to do a pretty good job of keeping this as clear as possible for the public to enjoy this, because that's really what it's about. It's about public engagement, getting people interested in the Hunley, and making sure people have the ability to appreciate it.
Now, I understand, though, we're behind this glass panel because that's not just water it's sitting in.
That is not just water it's sitting in. That is actually a solution of 1% sodium hydroxide. And the purpose of that sodium hydroxide is to actually help pull out the salts and chlorides that the metal kind of accumulated over time sitting at the ocean floor. So
I remember the first time I saw the sub, it still had a lot of crust on it, and these baths help kind of get all that off.
Yes. So one of the first steps in the conservation of the sub itself was actually to deconcrete the submarine. So there is a layer of concretion, which is just an organic layer on top of the iron that has to be physically removed. And then we inserted the solution to help pull out those salts and chlorides.
as I'm looking at the sub, where's the front, where's the back? Tell me how this works.
Absolutely. So to our left, we have the front or the bow, and then to the right, we have the stern, and then the port side, which is facing us, and starboard on the opposite side.
And what are the holes that we see on the top of the sub?
So as you can tell, we've actually removed some plates from the hull of the submarine, and that was so we could actually get in there and excavate the interior of the submarine, which was packed full of mud and sediment. So we had to actually excavate the interior of the submarine, much like you would do any other archaeological site.
Now, as I look inside, I can see the hand cranks that I got to use in the demonstration in the museum. It looks like it was really cramped in there.
Very, very cramped. Not a lot of wiggle room. You're right up next to everybody else. So yes, it's very cramped. It's only, 3.5 feet tall. It's very cramped. It's dark.
How did they see?
Well, they had one single candle, and we actually were able to excavate and recover that candle from inside the submarine. So that was kind of their one source of light inside the submarine.
Now I think about the smoke coming off a candle, making the air in there smoky. How much air did they have in there with them?
That's a really great question. So based off of historical record, they had about 2 hours. Now we've also run some, models and things like that to kind of figure out how much air they had. But based off of some of the experiments that they ran during the time of the Hunley prior to going out against the Housatonic, is they had about 2 hours. And they accomplished that by literally going and sitting at the sea floor and mock operating the hand crank to see how long that they had.
Now, as they cranked that hand crank when they were underway, how fast could that thing go?
So we've been able to determine that it had a cruising speed of about 1 to 1.5 knots, so just over a mile an hour, and a sprinting speed of about 4 to 5 knots. So not very fast.
When you say sprinting speed, I'm thinking of these guys.
Absolutely. So very short bursts, as fast as they can go, and still only getting up to about 4, maybe 5 knots.
Now, did they have a periscope that let them see if it was safe?
No periscope. The closest thing they had to a periscope is actually the conning towers. So what they would do is they would raise to the point where just the conning towers kind of broke the surface. And there are 2 portholes on the front of that forward conning tower that the captain, or Dixon in this case, could look out of to navigate.
Now, after they successfully completed their mission, they were supposed to flash a lamp to folks on shore. How would they do that?
So they had with them what we call the blue light. So it was a lantern with, a blue filter on it. And the idea was once they successfully attacked and sank the USS Housatonic and they were making their way back, they would raise that lantern to signal the crew on shore that would then light a big bonfire to help them navigate back. Because, unlike today, the shoreline would be pitch black during that time period, making navigation very difficult.
So they show the light goes out, and nobody hears from them again. That's where the mystery begins.
Yes. So originally in the historical record, we thought that they did have the opportunity to actually raise that blue light because the crew set the fire. Now, what we've actually been able to determine is it's unlikely that the Hunley, based off of its position when it was located, which is actually further out to sea past the Housatonic, the light that the crew from the beach was actually seeing was likely a flare from the USS Housatonic that would have looked blue off of the water.
The mystery deepens.
Exactly.
So the Hunley then sinks, and all the crewmen are aboard. They're still there when you find the sub years later.
Correct. So when we brought the Hunley here to the lab to begin excavations, one of the first and primary goals was to focus on the crew inside because this is a war grave. So we wanted to pay special attention to that to respect those that served on board the submarine.
Now, as you continue with the conservation efforts, how long will the Hunley be in this tank?
That is the ultimate question, and I wish I had a concrete answer for you. What we usually say is that the submarine will let us know when it's ready. So it's a very passive process. We don't quite know that answer for sure yet.
But the sub will let them know. So you've also been able to find other artifacts as part of that excavation. You had the chance to show some to us a few minutes ago, but you've got more to show.
We have more to show you. Yeah, we have a little bit more around Dixon. We'll show you the process of how we actually conserve and excavate those textile materials, that really fragile fabric.
So I'm getting to go behind the scenes into the lab. This is going to be exciting.
Absolutely. We'll go right there.
So here we get to see you do some archaeological science.
So what we have here, this is what we call block lift excavation. So a block lift is essentially a section of sediment recovered from the interior of the submarine that holds textiles. So very, very fragile clothing, cloth, things like that. And because the tight quarters inside the sub, which you already saw, and these are so fragile, it was safer to actually bring them out in as big of a chunk as we could and then do a much more controlled excavation here in the lab. So we have here kind of our 3-step process in how this kind of works. So we have the original block lift, and this is kind of after it gets uncovered and spread out, still soaking in water, and then the final product there, what we hope to kind of get.
So when you bring that out of the sub, do you necessarily know what's in that block?
We do not know what's in that block necessarily. One of the first things that we do, though, is x-ray that to see if there are any diagnostic artifacts within that block lift that we need to be aware of before we start working on it.
And then you bring it in here into this super scientific dihydrogen oxide.
Right. Fancy, fancy water. Yes, so we want to keep our artifacts soaked in water to keep them from drying out, which is one of the biggest enemies in terms of preservation. So we keep them soaking, and that's actually why we keep them in the water when we're excavating as well. It helps, maintain preservation, but it also helps with the structure of the textile itself. They're so fragile that the water actually helps keep them together.
Now, wait till you see this. He showed me his super scientific archaeological underwater tools. What do you have?
So what we have here is we use a syringe to actually kind of blow some of the sediment out in a very controlled manner, and then a small spatula. Well, a lot of the tools that we use in this phase are almost like dental tools because this stuff is so fragile.
And as you work at this, this obviously takes patience and a very calm, steady hand. How long does it take to uncover this?
So, like you said, this is a very slow-going process. So a block lift of this size could take upwards of 2 weeks, depending on what we find inside. So, for instance, if the textile within this block lift is very intact, one of the things that we're going to have to do after that is kind of unravel it and then clean that as well. So that's going to make it a little bit longer. As you can see here, this is from one of the crew members. His name was Miller, or at least tentatively known as Miller. And this is a vest. So this is a section of the vest that he was wearing the night of the attack. It's one of the front panels. And as you can see here, it still has remnants of some of the sediment, as well as the staining. You notice that red staining along that? That's actually from the corrosion product from the iron.
Oh. But it's fascinating because I can still see the checkers and the material.
Yep, that window pane checkered pattern is still intact, again giving us a little bit better understanding of the quality of this garment. So this is wool, fairly high quality, not the fanciest, not quite up there with Dixon in terms of cashmere, but still a very nice civilian style vest from that time period.
So by the time we get to this final panel, it's gone through many processes, a lot of hours of very patient, meticulous care. What are you going to finally do with a final product like this?
Well, eventually the idea is that this stuff will go on display so that people can kind of appreciate it and learn about these people as individuals, the ones who operated, the crew members on the submarine, to help tell their story, because this is an important part of who they were.
You told me earlier that as you uncover these artifacts and you get to know some of these men a little bit, it really personalizes this story for you.
It gives us a much better understanding of them as people, not just historical figures, but their everyday, the things that they found important. The submarine is so small that any artifact that we find inside the submarine had to have served some sort of purpose, whether it be personal or part of the operations of the submarine. So whatever they brought with them had to have served, at least very personal to them as individuals. So again, telling us the story about the crew.
Nick, this has been wonderful and fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for
Absolutely. Thank you for coming.
Talking with Nick about the work he's been doing reminds me that these men weren't just wax figures or anonymous names. They were people just like you and me. And that's why it's so important to continue to explore history the way we are.
We talked about the wealth that we had early on and through up until the Civil War. By the time the Civil War ended and all those events took place, we were the poorest. And for generations after that war, for all the different things we've laid out, Charleston struggled. We were really struggling to get back on our feet. So as you come and you travel and you enjoy Charleston, just always think that it hadn't always been this way. We've had our ups and downs.
One of the takeaways I have is that Charleston is accepting its past. Warts and all, as we like to say around the American Battlefield Trust. Charleston has a proud heritage of maritime history. It has the battles of the American Civil War, but it also had that shadow of slavery that came across here and the impact it had not only on Charleston, but on the United States as a whole. And they're trying to look into their past, interpret that today so that we can move on as Americans into the future, understanding our mistakes and learning from them.
I think we have this opportunity here in Charleston to protect our past and promote our future. We can't change what happened in the past, and if you understand history, what I want everybody to understand is that maybe you won't make some of the same mistakes. But we also have the opportunity here in this city to be an example for the entire country of how we can all get along and to move forward together.
We want to thank you for exploring Charleston with us, where we have gone back in history to the colonial times, through the Revolution, the antebellum period, up through the Civil War, and even today, where Charleston is experiencing a modern renaissance. We want to thank all of the supporters of the American Battlefield Trust for allowing us to be out here and for the work that they have done to preserve some of the areas that we visited today. We also want to thank the National Park Service for hosting us here at Fort Sumter. We hope that you'll take the time to explore this history for yourself, not only in person, but virtually online at battlefields.org, where the American Battlefield Trust has hundreds of hours of video that allow you to explore not only the history we've explored here, but other aspects of Charleston's deep, rich history. Also, don't forget that the American Battlefield Trust has a field trip fund that you can apply to that can let you come out to historic places just like this and walk in the footsteps of history your own. Thanks again to all the supporters of the American Battlefield Trust, whose financial generosity has made these trips possible. And thank you for all you've done to support battlefield education, preservation, and inspiration. I'm Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust. Thanks for being with us. If you want the opportunity to visit some national treasures of your own, treasures like Boston, like Charleston, New Orleans, Vicksburg, Mississippi, then you can take advantage of the American Battlefield Trust's virtual field trips. And if you'd like to go in person with your students, you can apply for field trip grant funding for the American Battlefield Trust. I'm Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust. Thanks for all you do to support battlefield preservation and education.